Well, we've reached week 17, the final week of the 2012 regular season. There's still several big games this week, despite the fact the playoff picture has cleared up. We know the 6 playoff teams in the AFC, but some stuff still to be decided in the NFC and some positioning still to be decided in the AFC. Let's talk about a few of these week 17 games now. First, let's start with the overall playoff picture. Okay, as I said, we know who the 6 AFC playoff teams are going to be. Houston, Denver, New England, Baltimore, Indianapolis, and Cincinnati are going to be your 6 playoff teams. Now, there are a couple of big things still this weekend in the AFC. The biggest, the most important, Houston going on the road to face the Indianapolis Colts. The Texans have never won in their franchise history in Indianapolis, and they need this game to secure home field advantage. If Houston loses this game and Denver wins and the Broncos are playing the Kansas City Chiefs, they're currently a 15-point favorite on BETDAQ, so all but a certainty Denver's going to win that game. Well, if the Texans lose and Denver wins, Denver gets home field. And home field advantage, to me, is a bigger deal for the Texans than any other team in the AFC. This is a team, it's not that they haven't shown the ability to win on the road. After all, they did win in Denver early this year, but they've been struggling in general over the last month, and I don't have much faith in them if they have to go on the road and play Peyton Manning and the Denver Broncos in January. So it's a key game for the Houston Texans on Sunday on the road in Indianapolis. The markets on any of these games haven't been released yet on BETDAQ, but I have talked to the traders and they've told me what the numbers are going to be. Houston is going to be installed as a 4-point favorite on BETDAQ over Indianapolis. We mentioned they've never won before in Indianapolis in their franchise's history. It'll be interesting to see the Colts because they've already clinched a playoff spot and they can't win the division, obviously, so the game does not have as much meaning for the Colts. It'll be interesting to see if they rest any guys because, you know, week 17, now that we've reached the final week of the season, that's something we have to take into consideration when handicapping these games. Motivations vary greatly from team to team. Some teams, like the Atlanta Falcons, who have locked up home field in the NFC, their game is completely meaningless this weekend. They host the Tampa Bay Bucks. Now, a line hasn't been released on BETDAQ or anywhere else in the known world for that game because we don't know yet what Atlanta Falcons are going to play. We assume people like Matt Ryan, Roddy White, Julio Jones will not play because, again, Atlanta has home field locked up. They could lose this game. Does not matter at all. So there will be a line released on this game before Sunday. It'd be interesting to see what that line is, who is favored. Because Tampa, even though they're going to be playing a team that might be playing backups, the Bucs have totally collapsed. They got off to a great start to the season. They've lost their last 5 games. 2 weeks ago, they were beaten 41-0 on the road in New Orleans. Just last week, they lost by 2 touchdowns at home to the St. Louis Rams, a team who a month and a half ago, Tampa seemed clearly better than. So Tampa, Atlanta, a game to keep an eye on, or maybe it's just a game to stay away from because Atlanta's going to be playing backups, and Tampa seems to have folded the tent, much like they did last year when they lost their final 10 games and were 1-9 against the spread in those games. Well, let's talk about the most meaningful games this week 17, and they all are NFC games because, as we said, we know who the 6 playoff teams in the AFC are going to be, but there's still some things to be sorted in the NFC. 4 NFC teams have clinched playoff berths: Atlanta, Green Bay, San Francisco, and Seattle. 4 other teams are alive: Washington, Dallas, Chicago, the New York Giants, and Minnesota. Make that 5 more teams are alive. Now, we'll start with the simplest first. The biggest game of this week 17 Sunday is the Washington Redskins hosting the Dallas Cowboys. Washington going to be installed as a 3.5-point favorite on BETDAQ. This is effectively a playoff game. The winner of this game wins the NFC East. The loser of this game will likely miss the playoffs. If Dallas loses this game, they've missed the playoffs for sure. Now, Washington could lose and still make the playoffs if both Minnesota and Chicago lose. But the Redskins, it's probably not going to happen. The Bears are favorites over the Detroit Lions. Detroit's a terrible team. They're 4-11. So effectively, both teams, Washington and Dallas, need to win this game to make the playoffs. We mentioned the Redskins are going to be installed as a 3.5-point home favorite on BETDAQ. This is an extremely intriguing game. We'll get more into it as the week goes along. I'm going to tell you right now, and we're sitting here on Monday. It's still 6 days before this game, but I have an early lean towards Dallas. That Washington defense, the Redskins have been able to win this year in spite of that defense. I know Robert Griffin III has been great, no doubt about it. I know the Redskins beat the Cowboys the first time these two teams played on Thanksgiving, got out to a big early lead. But it will be just like the Cowboys to lose last week in a big game at home against New Orleans, which they did, and turn around and go on the road to beat the Washington Redskins. Again, a lot of time between now and when that game's going to be played, and we're going to look more into that game, be putting up a full video preview of that game on the site as we do for all the games. But I don't know. Sitting here 6 days before, Dallas plus 3.5, it feels pretty good to me. But that is the biggest game of this Week 17 Sunday. A few other big games, though. The Minnesota Vikings hosting the Green Bay Packers. Green Bay installed as a 3-point road favorite in this game. Now, Green Bay just won 55-7. They beat the lowly Tennessee Titans 55-7. 3-point road favorites here against Minnesota. The Vikings have surprised everybody the last 3 weeks. They've won 3 games in a row. No win was more surprising than yesterday's win on the road in Houston. They dominated the Texans. Specifically, the Vikings defense dominated that Houston Texans offense. Vikings have been playing better and better on defense over the last several weeks. And Green Bay, until last week, until yesterday when they exploded for 55 points, they had not been the same offensively this year. They were 17th in the NFL in total offense heading into this last game. They had only scored over 31 points once the entire season after averaging 35 points per game last season. Now, they just scored 55 yesterday. So was that the Green Bay offense awakening at just the right time? Maybe so. Or was that just a case of them playing the Tennessee Titans? We'll see on Sunday, because this is a must-win game for Minnesota. If Minnesota wins, they are in the playoffs, and if they lose, they are most likely going to miss the playoffs. They need all kinds of help. So, huge game for the Vikings. A big game for Green Bay as well. Because if Green Bay wins this game, they lock up a first-round bye in the playoffs, which is big. And if the Packers lose this game and San Francisco wins, then Green Bay will not have a first-round bye in the playoffs. And the Niners, they face the Arizona Cardinals. They're double-digit favorites in that game, so they're most likely going to win. So, this is a game big for both teams. Minnesota must win to get in the playoffs. Green Bay must win to lock up a first-round bye in the playoffs. Again, Green Bay a 3-point road favorite. We'll be getting a lot more into that game as the week goes along, as we will all of these games. I want to like the Minnesota Vikings in this game. I really do. I want to like the Vikings. I decided a couple of weeks ago that I don't think Green Bay is quite as good as everybody else does. Now, that was before they won their last game 55-7. The big drawback with Minnesota, same thing that's been holding me back from backing this team the last 2 or 3 weeks, Christian Ponder. What they've got at the quarterback position. When it comes down to Christian Ponder versus Aaron Rodgers, well, that's no choice at all. However, every other part of these teams, you'd say advantage Minnesota, with the exception of the wide receiving core. So we'll just say the passing game. We'll group the passing game in as a whole, and that's a big advantage to the Green Bay Packers. But everything else, offensive line play, the running game, obviously Adrian Peterson, even though he was slowed last week, he can still break Eric Dickerson's single-season record. I believe he needs 209 yards on Sunday. But offensive line, running game, defense, it's all advantage Minnesota. They're playing at home. They desperately need the game. Green Bay needs the game too, but Minnesota needs the game worse. I want to like Minnesota, but am I going to be able to talk myself into backing Christian Ponder as only a 3-point underdog against Aaron Rodgers and the Green Bay Packers? I'm not sure about that. Now, if Green Bay does win that game, if they can beat the Vikings, then Chicago, all the Bears need to do is win, and they are in. Chicago is on the road in Detroit. The Bears only a 3-point favorite. This line struck me as kind of low. The Detroit Lions all season have been getting too much respect from odds makers. They've been a terrible team to back. Last week, a prime example, they were only 3 or 3.5 point home underdogs against the Atlanta Falcons, who came into that game with the NFL's best record. Atlanta won easily. I mean, Detroit made it competitive for a second in the second half, but wasn't competitive for very long. Atlanta won going away, leaving Detroit bettors to wonder once again why they had trusted this team, what exactly they saw in this team. Detroit is a prime example of statistics are for losers, because the Detroit Lions lead the NFL in pass yards per game. They're number 2 in total yards per game, but they're 4-11. They're just a bad team. Something I think is rotten to the core there in Detroit. Tough to put your finger on what it is. They seem to have too many good young players to be as bad as they are. Can they salvage something of this season, or at least can they send their division rival, can they end their division rival season with a bitter defeat? We'll see. The Bears have fallen apart over the second half of the season just like they did last year. They did pick up a win on the road against Arizona yesterday, but the Cardinals have been playing as poorly as any team in the NFL for the last couple of months. But if Green Bay can beat Minnesota, then Chicago, Detroit, it will be for the playoffs. If the Bears beat Detroit, they will make the playoffs. Now, if Minnesota wins, the Bears are eliminated from the playoffs, and there's nothing they can do about it. Another team that is still alive in the NFC playoff race, though it's somewhat of a long shot, the New York Giants. believe it or not, despite the fact the Giants were blown out 2 weeks ago by Atlanta 34-0, they lost a must-win game yesterday to the Baltimore Ravens. The Giants can still sneak in the playoffs if they beat the Philadelphia Eagles at home, and they're big favorites, 9-point favorites on BETDAQ, or at least that's what the number is going to be on BETDAQ. If they beat the Eagles at home and Minnesota, Chicago, and Dallas all lose. So it could happen. Minnesota faces the Green Bay Packers. They're underdogs in that game. Dallas faces Washington. They're underdogs. And the Bears, we just talked about, they're short road favorites against the Detroit Lions. So it's not inconceivable. We've seen stranger things happen. Those three teams could lose, and the Vikings probably will beat the Philadelphia Eagles. I count the Eagles as one of those teams who seems to have folded their tent. I'm not sure they're putting forth full effort anymore, even though maybe that's unfair. They were 2 touchdowns down to the Washington Redskins yesterday, and they came from behind, had a chance to tie that game at the end of regulation, so maybe I'm being unfair to the Philadelphia Eagles. Still, I do expect the New York Giants to pick up a win at home in that game. And believe it or not, if the Washington Redskins lose to Dallas, as we mentioned, they could still make the playoffs if both Minnesota and Chicago lose. So there you have it. There's your NFC playoff scenario. 4 teams have clinched: Atlanta, Green Bay, San Francisco, Seattle. The Washington-Dallas winner gets in. If the Vikings can beat the Green Bay Packers, they're in. If the Vikings lose and the Bears win, they're in. So as I said, a whole bunch of stuff can still happen on this Week 17 Sunday. I'd like to quickly talk about a couple of games now that are totally irrelevant in terms of the playoff picture, in terms of the big picture of the 2012 NFL season, but they're interesting from a bettor's perspective. Keep in mind, we can still make money off of all these games. I mean, they're offering markets on all these games, even the ones that are totally meaningless. One of those games, the New York Jets going on the road to face the Buffalo Bills. Buffalo's currently installed as a 3-point favorite, or they will be once the lines are released on BETDAQ. Both these teams have been going in the wrong direction. Buffalo, it's a lame duck administration there right now. Chan Gailey, not expected to be the head coach there next year. Ryan Fitzpatrick, not expected to be the starting quarterback there next year. The New York Jets, what else can we say about the dumpster fire that has become the 2012 Jets season? Their quarterback catastrophe culminated last week with them starting Greg McElroy, a guy who had thrown 7 career passes before last week's game, and he looked like a guy who had thrown 7 career passes. He took 11 sacks. That's right, 11 sacks, threw a terrible interception. I don't know if you saw the interception McElroy threw, but you could put up Mark Sanchez's worst interception of his career, and it right up there with the interception McElroy threw. Not sure where he was trying to throw that ball. Threw into triple coverage. The easiest interception the San Diego defensive back has ever had in his career. McElroy also turned the ball over in the second half another time on a sack fumble. So I know the Buffalo Bills have been playing terribly, and it's tough to get behind Buffalo, but I don't know about you. I was a little irritated at myself for not profiting off the New York Jets' misery last week. I mean, very predictable. Even though San Diego had just been blown out by the Carolina Panthers, in San Diego's last road game, they had beaten the Pittsburgh Steelers in a game that Pittsburgh had to have. So it didn't appear to me heading into last week's game that the Chargers had given up and stopped trying. And I said in the preview video we did for that game that I leaned towards San Diego, and I was irritated at myself for not following through on that. Well, I do think I'm going to follow through this week with an opportunity, a great opportunity, the last one we're going to get of 2012, to bet against the New York Jets. And you only have to lay 3.5 points here. You know, Buffalo, they've had a tough season. They're at home. We mentioned probably Ryan Fitzpatrick's last game in Buffalo, maybe Chan Gailey's last game as a coach. Something tells me the Bills, they were blown out in Week 1 by the Jets. Something tells me we're going to see an inspired effort from this Buffalo Bills team. And I think we're going to see the furthest thing from an inspired effort from the New York Jets. I lean towards Buffalo minus 3.5 in this game, and I doubt there's going to be anything that goes on throughout the rest of this week to change my mind. Another game that's interesting to me, even though it might not have playoff implications, the Carolina Panthers going on the road to take on the New Orleans Saints. Now, New Orleans, talk about a team that has not given up. The Saints, a couple of weeks ago, I said, I'm not sure about the Saints' motivation. You know, they were hosting the Tampa Bay Bucks, and I believe they're only a 3.5-point favorite. Tampa has the worst secondary in the NFL. They have for several weeks now. So when we talked about that game, I said, you know, normally this would look like a great opportunity to back the Saints. We know they've been the best home team in the NFL over the last 2 or 3 years. Obviously, the Seattle Seahawks have been the best home team in the NFL this year, but the Saints are something like 13-3 against the spread in their last 16 home games, somewhere around that area. and had an opportunity a couple of weeks ago to back them as short home favorites against the worst secondary in the league. To me, that would have been an auto play, except I question the New Orleans Saints' motivation at the time. You know, this is a team who's been a perennial contender. They were knocked out of playoff contention. They had just been blown out by the New York Giants. And they still had all the off-field issues swirling around them. You know, Paul Tagliabue making that final ruling on the bounty appeals and the fact that Sean Payton was still not their coach. I just wasn't sure that New Orleans was going to be fully there. However, they were most definitely there, blew out the Tampa Bay Bucks 41-0. Well, I saw that and went ahead and jumped on this Saints bandwagon yesterday, and it was a good move. They beat the Dallas Cowboys on the road. They almost blew it. Saints were up 31-17 with 5 minutes left in that game. They allowed Dallas to score 2 touchdowns in the closing minutes. That game went to overtime, but the Saints pulled it out in the end. Anyway, I think that game is proof that the New Orleans Saints are still playing hard, and I expect them. It's been such a tough season for them with everything that's gone on, with the bounty scandals, the players and coaches suspensions, everything else. They come home where they're so good, with a chance to put a bow on this season. It's been a tough season, but a chance to end it the right way with an 8-8 record, not a losing record, hosting a division rival at home. You see where I'm going with this. I know Carolina has been playing better the last month, but this feels like an opportunity to get on the New Orleans Saints to me. They've been so good at home, as we mentioned. Their offense, even though the Saints in general have struggled this year, their offense has not struggled at all. Drew Brees second in the NFL in pass yards per game. Now, Carolina's been playing better defense over the second half of the season. Finally, Ron Rivera has started to, we've started to see some dividends as far as defensively from Ron Rivera being the head coach there. Remember, Rivera came in there with a big reputation as a defensive guy. Very successful defensive coordinator stops in Chicago and San Diego. And last year, in his first year as Panthers coach, there was no evidence that they had a defensive guy as head coach. They were a terrible defense. The same was true through the first 3 or 4 weeks of this season. But the Panthers have really turned it around lately. All that being said, I don't expect them to slow down the New Orleans Saints offense. I do like the Saints. I have an early lean towards the Saints, -4.5 at home against the Carolina Panthers. Well, there's a few of those games that caught my eye. As I said, a bunch of things could still happen in this Week 17, especially in the NFC playoff picture. As always, we'll be previewing all these games throughout the week here on BETDAQ NFL, so we encourage you to check back throughout the week. And hey, I hope you have a Merry Christmas. Christmas Eve today, obviously to be Christmas tomorrow. Hopefully you'll be able to spend it with some loved ones. I know I will be. I'm looking forward to it. Anyway, Merry Christmas to you. Until we talk to you or see you tomorrow or maybe the next day for BETDAQ NFL, I'm John Arnette.